It all happened like I knew it would. A single drop of source magic. And, like flies to honey, the monsters swarmed. The rebel panicked. The carnage began. And the Magisters pointed their fingers at me. Just as I'd planned. I was shackled and collared and sent to Fort Joy. I'd come here to kill Godwoken. But instead, I became part of their story.
What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you our Story of Divinity Original Sin 2 video series. Now, a couple of qualifiers. Like all of my other Story of various Divinity game series, we are only focusing on the main plot, and by extension, some side quests that tie into the main plot. So we're not going to go in depth into like literally every single thing you can do. And realistically, with the nature of this game, I cannot possibly cover every permutation of every decision, though I will try to give you as much information as I possibly can. With those couple things out of the way, as you will have seen in the cinematic you just watched, we are sorcerers that are going to be on our way to the island of Fort Joy, which is where they take sorcerers that have used source magic, thus calling in the Voidwoken, as source magic appears to do. Now, I'm not going to cover character creation in any particular depth here, as I have in fact already made a video about that, which should be linked down below if all goes well. So if you're interested in the do's and don'ts, all that kind of stuff, you can click on that video and watch it. But jumping straight into it, we wake up with our character, whoever that might be, on this ship. The first floor we awaken to is actually a recently added tutorial section. So you used to jump up a floor actually, but in a patch they added this lower deck, which actually serves as a small tutorial for new players who are unused to isometric video games in general, but also specifically Divinity games. Once we're done with this area, which will teach you just a little bit about the actual game, you can head up the ladder. Now, once you get up the ladder is where you actually used to start the game proper. So there will be a Magister up here who you can have a short conversation with. Now, this Magister will basically tell us that we have been fitted with a source collar, which prevents us from using any kind of source abilities, and that we are bound for the island of Fort Joy, which we would have also learned from the cinematic. From here, if we leave this room, because there's not really much else we can do, we can walk past a room where there's a dead body with two Magisters investigating. Now, this is really just foreshadowing. When I first played the game, it kind of seemed to insinuate that you might actually be able to solve this murder, and while you technically can, there's nothing we can actually do, like as far as coming back to these guys and telling them about it, so we'll just move on. Moving into the main area of this deck of the ship, we actually seem to come to a bit of a common area. Now, this is where we can actually meet all of the origin characters who play our named companions. Later in the game, we can actually hire other companions, but they're kind of super generic and don't have a story. The origin characters, which you would have also been able to pick from yourself to play as during character creation, all have their own unique story. Now, I'm not going to be covering their stories a ton, but at the end of each video, I plan on doing a small wrap-up of what we learned about each origin character's potential outcomes. Even the ones I'm not playing with, I will kind of, at the end of each video, go over what each character kind of learns in that act, so you can expect that towards the end of the video. But the origin characters are the Red Prince, who is a prince from the Lizard Empire, Sabile, who is an elf assassin who was enslaved at some point, Losa, who is a musician who happens to play host to demons and other spirits at times, Ifan bin Metzt, who used to be a member of the Divine Order, which is the army of the Divine, that is, which we'll get into in a bit. Beast, who is a dwarf pirate. And Fane, who is a At this particular point, seemingly an elven scholar. We can talk to these guys, which will give us a bit of a flavor of each of their personalities. However, we're not going to dwell on that much here because, again, we're not covering a ton of their stories, but I will go over it kind of towards the end of the video on what we learned from each act, like I mentioned. From here, the only really other thing to do after we're done talking to everyone is honestly go talk to the guy on the upper left of this particular deck who will basically let us through because we have to go get registered, which is what the first Magister we spoke to told us to do. So once we go talk to this guy, he will let us through the door after a short conversation where you can make some remarks about how you feel about what's going on. But in the next room, we come across a woman named Wendigo being stopped by two Magisters. Now from this conversation, Wendigo here makes it very clear that she murdered the guy that we found earlier, and she's here to kill you, it would seem, because after this conversation, regardless of if you even try to help to, say, start a mutiny, she then goes on to attack everyone and try to seemingly destroy the ship. Functionally, what happens here after this conversation, Wendigo kills almost everyone on board besides the origin characters and a couple others. But for the most part, everyone's either knocked out or non-responsive at this particular moment because they're dead. We can gather some gear that's in a chest nearby and then head up the stairs to the next deck of the ship. From here, we basically need to escape because, as our character notes, something seems to be banging on the side of the hull of the ship. And you can also occasionally see things come through the sides. If we do a little bit of exploring, there are a couple of things to note. You can talk to a source hunter dog. There's a couple of Magisters in the back part of the ship that seem to have been trapped. None of that's really important. You can have another conversation with who turns out to not be an elven scholar, but rather an undead scholar of some sort, and he doesn't really seem to care about what's happening to the ship because he knows that worst case scenario he can literally just walk along the bottom of the sea to shore at some point. Now if we do a little bit of exploring, we can find out that this ship was actually also holding something called death fog. Death fog, which if you're unfamiliar with, is exactly what it sounds like. It's fog that instantly kills you. And that is quite literal. So if you as a character walk into death fog, it will kill you. It turns out that some of this was being stored on the ship. Now once you're done exploring this deck of the ship, you can actually head up the stairs, and from here we're actually about to head up to the actual outside area of the ship. Now as soon as we step out, we're basically attacked by these small slug-looking things that are mentioned as Voidwoken. So once we kill them, we can of course make our way out, and we find out that the ship is being attacked by a large kraken of sorts. From here we make all haste to a small lifeboat that is occupied by two children and a dwarf that we would have met earlier. So we can choose to leave immediately, or we can respond to what the kids are telling us, which is that there are still people on the boat and that we should go back and help them. Now if we choose to go back and help or leave early, it doesn't really change much. It will change some dialogue options, but that's about it. So what you can do is, if you choose to help, you can go back down the recently revealed ladder back to one of the original decks we were on, where we can save the other origin characters and fight a few more Voidwoken, as well as deal with the first Magister we actually spoke to. Or we can just choose to leave immediately. Both result in the ship being destroyed, you being tossed to sea, and this short cinematic playing.
I have plans for you, child. Rise.
Honorable Dallas, we lost a ship sailing sorcerer prisoners to Fort Joy. We assume some escaped and broke their collars. Their vile magic lured the Voidwoken. All who were aboard are presumed dead. Yours faithfully into eternity, High Judge Oriven.
After that short cinematic, where we saw a voice that we don't recognize kind of guide us to the shore through the ocean, basically lift us up out of it, we find ourselves waking up on the shore of the island of Fort Joy. Once we do a little bit of exploring and head the only direction really available to us, we run into a few more of the Voidwoken that we just saw earlier, and from here we can actually start putting our party together. Now we can have up to 4 party members, including ourselves, which allows us to take on 3 other origin characters as well as our avatar, and if you are playing an origin character, up to 4 origin characters. So, in the actual area of Fort Joy, in and around, you will find the other origin characters that you saved, and then you can, through dialogue, recruit them to your party. Now, again, we're not really going to cover a ton of that right this second. Now, when we're ready, we can actually head to the gates of Fort Joy proper, where we can see this scene between Alexander, the son of Lucian the Divine, his right-hand person, Dallas, and a Magister. They accuse, Dallas and Alexander that is, this Magister of helping people escape. And nothing you do really affects this too much. However, at the end of it, the Magister in question is outright killed by Dallas, who is known as the Hammer. That brings us to Fort Joy proper. Now, basically, we're tasked with escaping Fort Joy. So here's the thing. I've already made a video about all the ways to escape Fort Joy, so that will also be linked down below. You can look at that if you want, so we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on all of the ways that you can escape. However, I am going to go over a few of the important bits of information that you will find in Fort Joy, actually inside the fort, and they are this stuff. So, you can meet an elven seer named Sahala. She is important to the story later, and she explains that basically elves are in a bad way because Lucian, years ago when he was fighting to banish Damien, killed a ton of them. With death fog, actually. And Sahala is one of the last of the elven seers. Throughout the entire island of Fort Joy, but especially in the fort, we can find all sorts of mentions of a Brocus Rex, who is referred to as the Source King. Now, he died thousands of years ago, originally, and then in the events of Divinity Original Sin, he's actually killed again after he was resurrected. That again becomes important later. Also, we can find out about Geists, or silent monks as they're sometimes referred to as. So inside Fort Joy, we can run into a couple of these. In the actual area where we're being confined at right now, we can do a short side quest involving a Geist that is on a beach, and basically it's like a mindless monster almost that kind of introduces you to them. Inside the fort, we can actually run into a guy named High Judge Oravand, who actually explains what's happening. So basically, Source is this life energy. If you haven't played the other games and you don't know that, you're just finding this out from High Judge Oravand when you sneak into his room, or barge in, one or the other. Judge Oravand explains that basically, Source is this life energy, and the people who can channel it, when they do so, it calls Voidwoken, which then kill a bunch of people. So in order to solve this problem, they've been sending people to Fort Joy. Anybody who can channel Source gets sent to Fort Joy as a prisoner. And then from there, they are purged of that Source through a process that is not awesome. So High Judge Oravand shows us this process, but basically it leaves the person in question that was just purged of their Source in a bad way, and basically turns them into Geists. They're like zombies almost. They're like, you know, the lights are on but nobody's home kind of thing. And then we can actually run into a guy named Virtus in the dungeons. So Virtus is important because he is actually a Godwoken, which we don't know right now, but it's made very obvious. The important thing about Virtus is that he is one of many clues you can find that will point you towards a secret group of seekers in the swamps of Fort Joy proper, the actual island. This, in combination with all of the other rumors that we can find in and around the fort about these seekers, including the conversation we ran into between Alexander and Dallas and all them, where they're accusing Magister Atusa of sending people to these seekers. Obviously, once we escape, we can go looking for this camp that is supposed to be out there in the swamp of these seekers who are apparently helping refugees. Now, the last thing I want to mention before we start moving on to the rest of the island is Paladin Cork. So, if you actually go to like the main courtyard area of the Fort Joy fort, you will find Paladin Cork asking to be let in to basically inspect and see what's going on inside, and he has refused entry, and they actually outright attack him. So this is an important conversation because this is what tells you that the Magisters and the Paladins of the Divine Order are at odds. So technically, the Divine Order is the militant arm of the Divine, who is the embodiment of the 7 gods in Rivellon, which is the subject of several of the other Divinity games, but if you're just now learning of it, the Divine is in fact the embodiment because he's a piece of power of every god in one person. And the Paladins are his direct followers, and since the Divine Lucian died supposed to have died, 9 years before the events of this game, some of his army has split into groups, so the Magisters are one of those groups. Now, the Magisters serve his son, Alexander, which is the guy we ran into earlier. Just a little bit of world building because that's an important conversation. So now you know that the Paladins and the Magisters are not getting along, or at least the Magisters are deliberately keeping secrets from the Paladins, we should say. So once we leave Fort Joy, we can run into Zalasgar, which is an undead guy in the swamp who is the subject of a few quests. And we can actually also run into Wendigo, the very woman who caused all that destruction on the ship we were on, who basically flat out tried to kill us. Now, Zalasgar is non-violent. We do not have to fight him at all. Now, Wendigo, when you run into her, will try to kill you outright. Again, these two are important because conversations with them point to the undead being raised recently in droves by some outside force for some sort of pact. They won't really give you any details, and it is, mostly just kind of foreshadowing. Once we actually start exploring the swamps of the island of Fort Joy, we can run into a ruins where we will get attacked by a ton of Voidwoken, and we'll also start hearing voices as we walk over certain areas of the map, kind of guiding us to a certain location. The voice we heard that pulled us out of the water when we first came to the island, actually. From here, ideally, we're going to want to find the camp of Seekers. So it's actually not hard to find. It's probably the easiest place to get to, as it is just beyond the ruin I just mentioned, and is kind of avoids a ton of fights that you would otherwise have to have. So once we get to this camp, we're going to obviously talk to the Seekers that are there, and they're going to explain a couple things. That A, they've already had one fight with the Magisters when they arrived, and they're not doing great, because the Magisters are employing a weapon known as Shriekers. So, the Magisters have been studying the things about Brocus Rex they've found here. Now, if you remember, Brocus Rex is the Source King. Well, the island of Fort Joy was Brocus Rex's stronghold. It's where he did a ton of research into Source and what it can do. The Magisters have been looking into that research, and what they've come up with is a weapon called Shriekers. Shriekers are awful. Basically, they put a person up on a pike, that person slowly decays into a shrieker. It's kind of like a crucifixion almost. And that power actually enables the Shrieker to basically channel pure source, which instantly kills people. So basically, the Seekers are asking you to do two things. Find a weapon to kill the Shriekers, and also find their leader Gareth, because Gareth went off to find a weapon to kill the Shriekers with, and he hasn't come back. So, from here, where I actually recommend going first is actually really close to the Seekers camp. It's just down a vine thing and across a beach to Brocus Rex's vault. Now, we can actually find a couple of books around the island that point us to this location, or you can just stumble across it. Brocus Rex's vault is roughly down the vine. It's like right next to the Seekers camp. It's pretty hard to miss. In that vault, we will be accosted, let's say, by a undead guy named Trompdoy, I guess. Now, as we traverse the cavern, it turns out that Trompdoy is one of many people that Brocus Rex cursed, and he tasked Trompdoy with protecting this vault. Once you get to the end of this, which actually involves deliberately fighting Trompdoy and seeing through his illusions, because he was a bard of sorts, we can make our way to the actual vault part of Brocus Rex's vault. Now, in this vault, we will find a weapon that can kill the Shriekers, which is nice. There's actually several, but here's one of them. We can also find a ton of soul jars, and we can have one last conversation with Trompdoy. One of the soul jars is Trompdoy's. Now, basically, the soul jars are exactly that. They hold someone's soul. So if you destroy Trompdoy's soul jar, he can finally rest, which is what he really wants, and he apologizes for harassing you all the way through this dungeon. Make your decision, it doesn't really matter. Now, all these other soul jars belong to a few different people. 3 of them we probably haven't met yet. The other 2 belong to a Captain Zepsakor as well as a Gratiana. So Captain Zep Sikor is part of the Relics of Rivellon DLC gift bag, which gives you a armor set for completing it. You should totally do it, but it's not relevant to the main plot. Gratiana is actually someone you've probably met in the Seeker's Camp. Gratiana, as it turns out, if you take this soul jar back to her and have a conversation with her, she tells you that she actually used to be Brocus Rex's concubine because she is undead, and that if you give her soul jar, she would appreciate it, or you can destroy it and kill her because she has done awful things in her past despite being redeemed now. Honestly, this choice doesn't matter. It's kind of really just however you feel about it. However, it affects literally like one inslide, and basically it's if you let her live, she gets added to an inslide. That's literally it. So beyond that, do what you will. It is a neat little side story that you should look into. Before we actually leave Brocus Rex's vault, as we go to leave, you will notice a statue in a room not too far away from you. If you interact with this statue, because it is interactable, it will basically enthrall you, and you'll find yourself teleported to a place called the Hall of Echoes. Now here's where things get interesting. This actually differs depending on what type of character you are playing, but the long and short of it is you will meet your character's appropriated god. If you are playing, say, Ifan, you will meet Rollick. If you are playing Beast, you'll meet Duna. If you're playing Sabil, you'll meet Tersendilius. You meet the god appropriate to your race, because in Rivellon there are these 7 gods who created the races. Technically there's only 6 races, but one of those gods, Ahmadiyya, decided that because she didn't have a race to make, she was going to be in charge of the wizards of the world. So if you choose to play a non-origin character who is also like undead or something, you'll get Ahmadiyya. Ahmadiyya is kind of the default catch-all god for this particular situation, by the way. But basically, your character will meet whatever divine or otherwise being in this conversation who will grant you the power to bless. And basically in this conversation, in addition to being taught how to bless, your god explains that you are God-woken, which means you are basically a champion of the gods with the potential of becoming the next divine. Because as I mentioned earlier, the previous divine died several years ago, and there needs to be a new one. And the term for the people who can take up that mantle is God-woken. So your god has chosen you, that's the voice you've been hearing, and should you choose to follow its commands and gain power, you'll be good to go. But first order of business is getting the hell off of this island. And that's basically the mission your god gives you, is literally just to get off this island as of right now. So from here we can finally exit the vault of Brocus Rex, which leaves us with saving Gareth, as we found a wand to destroy the Shriekers with in the vault itself. North of the Seeker's Camp, we can actually find Brocus Rex's armory. Now, in this particular area is where we can find Gareth. He is being attacked by Magisters. We can save him, and he'll explain that he was at the armory looking for a weapon to kill the Shriekers with, and he'll appreciate you saving him, and he'll leave. Now, if you choose to explore the armory at all, you can find the helmet of Brocus Rex, which basically gives you the same power as the wand that you found in Brocus Rex's vault, which is to drain the source from a target, which then kills it, which in the Shrieker's case just completely kills them outright. So that is one, again, of several weapons you can find to deal with the Shriekers that you're going to be finding soon. Now, once we've saved Gareth, we can go back to the Seeker's Camp and speak to him there, where basically he'll explain that, you need a weapon to deal with the Shriekers, but because we already have that, you can then go like, yeah, we totally have that. We've got it covered already. Gareth will also take this time to explain, if you talk to him, that Seekers are, again, a faction of the Divine Order, but their specific mission is to find and guide God-woken on the path to becoming the actual divine. Because of that, and the fact that you yourself are God-woken, they're here to help you, basically. Now, once we've saved Gareth, and we have in fact rallied the Seekers through finding a weapon to deal with the Shriekers that are blocking the harbor of Fort Joy, which is where we can leave from, we can basically send them off to the harbor area. Now from here, they will actually abandon the Seeker's Camp you're at, and they will move across the way a little bit to the harbor area of Fort Joy, to a camp set up there just outside of the harbor. Once we go to the camp, we can talk to Gareth or Gratiana and basically tell them we're ready, but that won't actually do anything. The way to advance this particular part of the game is to actually physically destroy the 5 or 6 Seekers that are guarding the harbor. Technically, you don't have to destroy them, but that's what's going to get the next phases of conversation rolling, shall we say. Now, from here, Gareth and the Seekers will advance forward, and basically they'll say that Gareth is going to take a bunch of them and row out to the actual ship you plan on leaving from, while you and your party deal with the Magisters at the actual harbor, which happens to include Alexander. We will have to fight and kill Alexander here. So this is a tough fight, obviously. This is the last boss fight, shall we say, of Act 1. It is difficult, especially for newer players, especially if you're on a higher difficulty. So when you actually damage Alexander's health, he will, well, he won't personally, but a Voidwoken will be summoned into the fight that will then distract all of the adds, because there are a ton of adds. Just keep in mind this is a tough fight. If you're playing on higher difficulties, I actually recommend teleporting Alexander away from all of his enemies, so they have to waste a turn or two getting to you while you guys all gang up on Alexander and hopefully kill him before you have to deal with the adds. So once you win this fight, you will be immediately accosted by a woman named Malady, who appears to be half elf, half demon, and Malady will immediately recognize you as Godwoken. And from this conversation, she'll explain that she needs to take you to a woman named Meister Siva in Reaper's Coast, who will help guide you, because she's a member of the Seekers as well, Meister Siva that is, and she will help guide you on your path to divinity as you are Godwoken. So Malady at this point will, if you have not already taken your particular collar off, she will break the source collars around the necks of all of your party members if any of them still have them on, which will of course allow you to access your source magic. So that will actually wrap up Act 1, but I did mention that we are going to go over everything that happens with the origin characters in the end of each video. So honestly, in Act 1, not a ton happens. So, to explain it rather briefly, the Red Prince, he will learn that he needs to find a dreamer named Bramos on Reaper's Coast, basically. So lizards have these members of their society known as dreamers, and those dreams that those dreamers have will allow them to have visions of things. The Red Prince is looking for someone, and these dreamers are basically telling him who to look for, but basically none of the dreamers on Fort Joy are strong enough with their gift to tell him exactly where to look. So they basically tell him to go find their head dreamer guy, a guy named Bramos on Reaper's Coast, and that's basically it. Sabile is a slave escapee who was forced to kill a bunch of people using the slave scar on her cheek. So lizards have this practice of using what they call slave scars, and then through songs they can activate the magic of that slave scar and basically force the slave to do anything they want. Sabile was unfortunately one of these slaves, but she escaped. She's trying to track down the person who kidnapped her and delivered her to her slaver. She will actually talk to Zalasgar, one of the undead in the swamps, and that person will be like, oh yeah, you're looking for a guy named Roost Anlon. He's in Driftwood Reaper's Coast area, and he'll tell Sabile where to go for that. Haifan bin Metzt actually has probably the most interesting of all of the personal story things going on right here. Haifan bin Metzt is a member of the Lone Wolves, and he was tasked with doing nothing short of killing Alexander. So, obviously, the last one act boss is Alexander, so Haifan will have, of course, killed Alexander, and now he needs to report back to Roost Anlon, the leader of the Lone Wolves in Reaper's Coast. Beast, the dwarf origin character, probably has the least going on in Act 1, to be honest with you. Not much, really. He's trying to get back at his cousin, the Queen of the Dwarves, who basically had him captured and sent to Fort Joy in a lot of ways, but basically he just needs to get back to Driftwood so he can talk to some dwarves about what's going on with that situation, because he uncovered a plot of sorts with the Queen. So Beast probably has the least going on in the Fort Joy area. Basically all Beast does is find the location of a guy named Lohar who he needs to talk to, which is another dwarf who is also in the Driftwood Reaper's Coast area. The Undead Scholar was investigating the Black Pits, which is an area in Reaper's Coast, and he would very much so like to go back there to continue his research, so that's where he is headed. And he can also, hopefully, repair his mask of the shapeshifter that was broken, or he can recover it from Wendigo and give it back to Fane, and that mask is what allows him to don the look of other races and not look undead, and thus very noticeable everywhere he goes. And then lastly, Losa. So Losa, if you go to talk to Sahala with Losa in your party, becomes very apparent that she is being possessed, Losa that is, by a demon who is slowly taking over her soul. Basically, Losa needs to find someone to help her with this. And that someone, you guessed it, is in Driftwood Reaper's Coast area. So basically what you know about Losa is that she's slowly being taken over by a demon, and she's trying to find somebody to help her with this problem like ASAP. So that is kind of everything that's going on with the origin characters in the Act 1 Fort Joy area. Now, in Act 2, we're actually going to cover the boat ride to Driftwood Reaper's Coast area, because that is actually part of the transitional period between the acts, but I'm going to cover that in the Act 2 video as well. So there it is, guys. The main plot and everything surrounding Act 1 of Divinity Original Sin 2. I certainly hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, by all means, let me know down in the description below, where you can also find the links to the 2 videos I mentioned earlier in this video as well. So thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.
Tired but victorious, the party made for the Lady Vengeance. The horrors of Fort Joy behind them. They arrived as sorcerers. They left as godwoken. The fate of this godforsaken world now rested on their shoulders. Or at least on the shoulders of one of them.